They came at dawn when the fog still kissed the mud, their boots heavy. With threats they fired into the air, and shouted, "This land is ours now." And the birds scattered from the old tree, near the well, the tree that had seen births and burials and rain upon rain, and the mud under the boots of children, now turned under the boots of men, who came demanding power. The chief stepped out of his hut with his hands raised, with his old eyes watching the guns with no fear but a deep sadness in the lines of his face. The villagers stood in doorways, some clutching their shirts, some clutching spoons frozen halfway to their mouths, the smoke from morning fires rising thin and uncertain as the soldiers laughed, as they kicked the pots, as they pointed at the goats and said, "These are ours now," as they pointed at the women and said, "You will cook for us now." The children watched from under the mats, where they crawled to hide. They saw the chief raise his hand and say, "This is not your land. This land belongs to the spirits of our fathers. This land is not for sale." And the soldiers pointed their guns at the chief, and the air felt like it would break. The wind stopped and the goats stopped chewing, and the world leaned to listen to what would happen next. The tallest soldier with a scar on his lip spat on the ground and said, "We will take what we want, old man, or we will burn your huts, we will burn your grain, we will take your sons and your daughters." And the chief stood straight in the fog and said, "If you came for war, you will find it, but you will not leave with peace." And the soldier slapped the chief, and the sound was like a gunshot in the morning stillness. The women gasped, but no one moved. The men held their breath. The chief fell to one knee but lifted his face again with blood on his lip and said, "You have chosen your path." The soldiers tied the chief with rough rope, pulling his arms back until he winced. They tied him to the tree near the well, so everyone could see, so everyone could be afraid, and they fired another shot into the air, to remind the birds, to remind the people, to remind the morning, that they were now here. The chief closed his eyes and remembered the stories his father told him, stories of when invaders came before with chains and whips and guns, stories of when the people hid in caves and under the river reeds, stories of when they returned in the night to fight with sharpened sticks and stones and fire in their hearts. The chief opened his eyes and saw a boy in the crowd, Jonah, with thin arms and bright eyes, hiding behind a barrel, watching with anger, not fear. The chief nodded to him just once, and the boy felt something wake in his chest, something like a promise, something like thunder rolling far away. The soldiers took the goats and poured the grain on the ground, stamping on it with their boots, laughing, while they pointed their guns at the sky, as if to shoot the clouds, as if to kill the dawn itself. The village watched, and the crows came back to the tree to watch, to waiting for what would come next, waiting for what the people would do, waiting for whether they would choose fear or choose the storm rising in the eyes of a boy who saw everything, who would remember everything, who would not let it pass. Jonah saw them from the roof where he hid among the palm leaves, the morning sun crawling over the hills, as the soldiers dragged the old chief from the tree and pushed him to the ground near the well, the ropes cutting into his wrists. The chief looked smaller now, but his eyes were still like the river, silent but deep. The soldiers laughed as they poured water over his head, cold water that dripped into the dirt, making dark mud that touched the chief's knees as he tried to rise again. Jonah felt the anger in his chest like a drum that would not stop, like the beating wings of the doves that circled above, confused by the noise, by the smell of smoke that was now rising from the edge of the village where the soldiers had thrown burning sticks into the dry grass. The goats ran from the flames, and the chickens screamed as they flew toward the trees, but the soldiers did not care. They only wanted the people to watch. They only wanted fear. Jonah saw his mother standing near the door of their hut with his little sister clinging to her leg, his mother with eyes dark from no sleep, her hand covering his sister's eyes, so she would not see the chief fall again into the mud when the soldier kicked him. Jonah wanted to scream, but he bit his tongue until he tasted blood, and he remembered what the chief had said with only a look, when they tied him to the tree, that there would be a time to shout, but this was the time to watch and remember. So Jonah watched as the soldiers gathered, the men of the village, and shouted at them, calling them cowards, calling them worthless, demanding they bring more goats, demanding they bring their daughters to cook for them, to clean their boots, to pour water for them as they sat under the tree. The same tree where the chief had been tied, the same tree that watched everything. Jonah saw his uncle step forward with his hands raised, trying to speak, trying to calm the soldiers, saying they would give what they could if only they would leave the people in peace. But the soldiers only laughed and pushed his uncle to the ground beside the chief, kicking him in the stomach and taking the small bag of dried beans He had carried. Jonah saw his uncle curl around the pain, but he did not cry out. He only looked at the chief, and the chief nodded once. Jonah saw that nod, and he knew it was a promise that the people would not forget, a promise that the day would come when the soldiers would learn what it meant to demand war from people who still had the mountain in their bones. Jonah slid from the roof and crawled behind the huts through the smoke, past the women who were hiding the small children in the yam pits, covering them with palm fronds to keep them quiet. Jonah moved like the lizards that ran under the dust. He moved with the dust, with the ash, with the silence that was thicker than the smoke. He moved toward the edge of the village, where the hills rose waiting for him, where the elders hid waiting for news, waiting for the sign that it was time. Jonah did not look back, as the soldiers shouted again, as the goats screamed, as the crows lifted from the tree. Jonah did not look back because he carried the promise of the chief in his chest like a spark, waiting for the wind. Jonah ran across the fields barefoot, over sharp stones and thorns, the earth warm under his feet, the wind carrying the smoke from the burning grass, the air filled with the cries of the goats and the laughter of the soldiers who thought they owned the morning. But the hills were waiting, and the elders were waiting, and Jonah could feel the promise in his chest growing heavier with every step he passed the river, where the women used to wash clothes, where children used to splash water in the heat of the day. But now the river was silent, watching the smoke in the sky. Jonah did not stop. He climbed the small ridge where the path turned narrow, and the trees grew close together, their leaves hiding him from the eyes of the soldiers if they were looking for him, if they cared that a boy was running to tell the truth. Jonah climbed until he reached the clearing, where the elders waited, their faces dark and carved with lines like the old rocks, their eyes sharp even in the morning light. The elders sat in a circle near the ashes of a small fire, the smoke rising thin and straight into the sky, the way prayers used to rise before the invaders came, before the rifles and the boots and the fear. Jonah stood breathing hard, his chest rising and falling, his eyes never leaving the faces of the elders. The tallest elder, with gray hair that fell to his shoulders, nodded once, and Jonah stepped forward and spoke. The soldiers have come. They have taken the chief. They have tied him to the tree. They have beaten him. They have taken the goats. They have burned the grain. They say they will take the daughters to serve them. They say they will take whatever they want. They say this land is theirs. Now the elders listened without speaking. The wind moved through the trees above them, carrying the scent of smoke, the sound of birds crying out as they fled the fields. The tallest elder closed his eyes for a moment, and the others waited the way the earth waits for rain. Then he opened his eyes and said, "We knew this day would come. We have seen it before. We will see it again. But now we must choose if we will kneel or if we will stand." And there was a silence, a heavy silence that wrapped around them like the dark before dawn. Jonah felt it in his bones, the choice hanging in the air, the promise waiting to be spoken. The elder looked at Jonah and said, "You are young, but your eyes have seen what many men fear to see. You have carried the truth to us, and now you must carry the fire back to them." Jonah swallowed the fear that rose in his throat and nodded. The elder reached into the ashes of the small fire and took a small blackened stick, handing it to Jonah, the ash marking Jonah's hand. The elder said, "Remember this moment, remember who you are, remember who they are, and remember that the land does not belong to them. It belongs to those who are willing to carry its spirit." Jonah took the stick and felt the warmth, the memory of fire in it, and he turned back toward the village where the smoke was rising higher, where the soldiers were waiting, where the promise of the chief was waiting for him to return. At night, Jonah crept back to the village, moving like the mist that rolled in from the river, moving between the shadows of the burned huts, moving past the ashes where the grain once lay, waiting to feed the children. Jonah held the blackened stick in his hand, feeling the warmth of the elder's promise still there, even in the cold of the night. He saw the soldiers sitting around the fire near the tree where the chief was tied, their laughter loud in the darkness as they passed a bottle between them, the fire crackling, throwing sparks into the black sky like small angry stars. The chief sat with his head down, but Jonah could see his eyes open. Reflecting the fire, the chief was waiting. Jonah crawled on his belly past the goats that lay tied together, their eyes rolling in fear, past the women who were hiding near the edges of the huts, their hands pressed over the mouths of the smallest children to keep them quiet. Jonah moved like the lizards in the dust, silent and patient. The moon slid through the clouds, lighting the ground in silver patches. Jonah froze every time the soldiers turned their heads. Every time one of them stood to throw another stick into the fire. Jonah could hear the river moving in the distance, calm and steady, as if it did not care about the noise, about the fear, about the smoke that still hung in the air. He reached The tree, and the chief lifted his head, their eyes meeting. The chief did not speak, but Jonah saw a small nod, a small promise, that they were still alive, that they were not finished. Jonah moved to the back of the tree, his fingers working at the knots in the rope. The rope was rough and burned against his skin, but Jonah did not stop. He could hear the soldiers talking about taking the daughters in the morning, about burning the rest of the huts, about teaching the people who was in charge. Jonah felt the promise of the elders in his chest, the fire they had given him, the reminder of who they were. He felt the rope loosen. The chief shifted slowly, careful not to draw the eyes of the soldiers. Jonah pulled the last loop free and the rope fell into the dirt. The chief stayed sitting, his hands moving to his sides, ready to rise. When the moment came, Jonah slid back into the shadows. The chief lowered his head again, as if he were still bound. The soldiers did not see, the soldiers did not know. Jonah moved back, past the huts, past the goats, past the women who saw him, and knew in their eyes, they knew that the chief was free, that the promise was alive. Jonah returned to the edge of the village, where the oldest of the young men waited, holding sticks and old machetes, their eyes wide with fear and something else. Something like the storm that gathers over the mountains in the heat of the day. Jonah nodded, and they nodded back. The night was quiet around them, the fire crackled, the soldiers laughed. The river moved, the promise lived. They waited for the moment when the village would rise, when the fear would turn into thunder, when the people would take back what was theirs. Jonah saw the stars above the village blinking like watchful eyes as the night grew deeper, as the cold pressed against his skin, as the smoke from the soldiers' fire drifted in thin lines into the sky. He stood with the young men near the edge of the village, each one holding a stick, a blade, a stone, whatever they could find, their hands shaking not from fear alone but from the waiting. From the weight of the moment that was coming. The chief was free now, but still he waited under the tree. Like a shadow, the soldiers laughed around their fire. One of them stood and began to sing, a loud, ugly song that made the women hiding near the huts close their eyes. The song was about how the soldiers would take what they wanted, how they would break the spirit of the village, how they would leave nothing but ashes. Jonah felt the promise in his chest burn hotter with every word of that song. He felt the wind change, as if the earth itself was listening, waiting for the people to rise, waiting for the village to remember who they were. Jonah looked at the young men, their faces pale in the moonlight, their eyes dark and wide. He saw the fear, but he also saw the fire. He raised the blackened stick the elder had given him, and the young men raised their weapons too. In silence, the chief looked up from where he sat under the tree, his eyes finding Jonah in the dark, and in that moment Jonah felt the river in his blood. The river that moved without stopping, that carried life even in the dry season, that did not bow to fear or fire. Jonah stepped forward, moving slow at first, careful of the dry leaves under his feet, careful of the goats that shifted and bleated softly as if they too could feel what was coming. The soldiers did not see him. They were too busy with their song, with their laughter, with the bottle passing from hand to hand. The fire crackled, throwing sparks into the night. Jonah moved closer until he could see the face of the soldier with the scar on his lip, the one who had struck the chief, the one who had kicked Jonah's uncle. The soldier was laughing, his mouth wide, his eyes shining in the firelight. Jonah felt the stick in his hand, felt the promise in his bones. He stepped closer and raised the stick high, and brought it down on the soldier's head. The sound was soft, almost nothing compared to the laughter, compared to the crackle of the fire. The soldier fell without a cry, his bottle rolling into the dirt, spilling its bitter smell into the air. For a moment everything was still. The fire crackled, the river moved, the goats shifted, the women held their breath, and then the chief stood. The young men charged from the shadows, their voices rising not in fear but in the cry of the storm, the cry that breaks the dry earth to bring the rain, the cry that says, "We are here, we are alive, we will not kneel." The soldiers turned in shock, their hands reaching for guns that were too far away, their faces twisted in fear, as the people of the village fell upon them with sticks, with stones, with the promise of the river, with the fire of the mountain. Jonah felt the fear leave him as he swung again and again, as the chief shouted above the noise, as the night filled with the sound of a people who had remembered who they were. The night burned with the fire of voices that would not be silenced. The soldiers tried to fight back, but their rifles were far and their fear was close. Their hands shook as they reached for blades, as they tried to push away the sticks and stones that fell on them like rain. Jonah saw the chief move through the fight with the strength of the river, his hands steady, his eyes clear, his voice rising above the cries, telling the people to push, telling them to stand, telling them to remember who they were. The young men swung their machetes, cutting through the ropes that held the goats, freeing them into the dark. The goats ran bleating into the hills, carrying the fear of the soldiers with them. The women came from the shadows, carrying pots of hot water, carrying stones, carrying courage, their faces hard in the light of the burning huts. The soldiers who had laughed now screamed as the people of the village closed around them, as the fire spread, as the river of courage rose. Jonah felt his arms grow tired, but he did not stop. He swung again and again, the blackened stick in his hands, heavy with the promise of the elders, the promise that the land would not kneel, the promise that the children would not grow up in chains. The chief reached the soldier with the scar on his lip, who was crawling in the dirt, trying to find a weapon, trying to find a way to stand. The chief stood over him, the moon shining on his face, the fire crackling behind him, and for a moment everything was quiet. The soldier looked up, his mouth open with words that would never come, and the chief raised his hand and brought it down. The soldier fell back into the dirt, and the night moved again. The people shouting, the people crying, the people taking after what had been taken. The fire spread to the tents of the soldiers, the flames rising into the dark sky, painting the faces of the villagers in orange and red, the smoke lifting into the stars, carrying with it the memory of the fear that was now broken. Jonah saw the women holding their children, close, tears on their faces, not of fear but of something older, something deeper, the knowledge that they had stood, that they had not run, that they had not bowed. The young men pulled the remaining soldiers into the center of the village, where the chief stood waiting, his eyes on the dawn that was beginning to break on the hills. The light soft but growing stronger. The chief raised his hands and the people fell silent, the soldiers on their knees. The chief spoke, his voice steady. He said, "You came demanding war, but we will take your king, we will take the spirit you brought, and we will return it to the dust from which it came." The soldiers shook in the cold dawn, their eyes wide, their hands tied with the same rope they had used on the chief. The chief turned to the people and said, "The land will remember this day. The children will remember this day. We will plant our seeds in soil that is free. We will teach our children to walk on this land without fear." And the people raised their voices as the sun broke over the hills, as the light touched the ashes, as the river moved in the distance, calm and strong, as the promise of the elders lived in the hearts of the people who had taken back the dawn. The dawn came slow over the village, touching the ashes, with soft light touching the faces of the people who stood in silence around the soldiers, who were now prisoners, tied with ropes made from the same fibers they once laughed at. The chief stood, with the dawn on his shoulders, his eyes looking at the horizon, where the sun was rising, like a promise, like a reminder that even the longest night ends. Jonah stood near the chief, holding the blackened stick in his hand. His arms were tired, his legs were shaking, but in his chest there was a calm, like the river that moved even when no one was watching. The women began to gather near the well, holding their children close. The young men stood in a circle around the prisoners, their faces hard but their eyes tired from the long night. The chief raised his hand and the people grew silent. The only sound was the crackle of small fires and the soft cry of a baby waking to the new day. The chief spoke, saying, "This land is ours, and it will remain ours." These men came demanding war. They came with fear, they came with fire. But we have shown them that we are not afraid. We have shown them that we will stand for our children, for our rivers, for our seeds, for our dawn. The people nodded. The chief turned to the prisoners and said, "You will return to your leaders, and you will tell them what you saw here. You will tell them that the people of this land are not broken. You will tell them that we do not kneel." The soldiers shook. One of them began to weep, his shoulders shaking like dry leaves in the wind. The chief looked at him, and then looked at the others and said, "We will not keep you here. We will not kill you, because we are not you. We are the river, we are the mountain, we are the dawn, we are the land." The young men stepped forward and cut the ropes from the soldiers. The soldiers stood slowly there, eyes wide, looking at the people who surrounded them, looking at the chief who stood like the mountain, looking at Jonah who held the blackened stick like a promise. The chief pointed to the hills and said, "Leave. Now take your fear with you, take your hunger with you, take your war with you, and do not return." The soldiers began to walk, their feet stumbling over the dirt, their eyes looking back again and again at the people who watched them, at the women who held their children, at the young men who held their sticks and blades, at the chief who stood with the dawn on his shoulders. Jonah watched them go. He felt the river in his blood, he felt the fire in his bones, he felt the promise in his heart. The people began to move, gathering water from the well, gathering the goats that had returned from the hills, gathering the seeds that had not burned, gathering the hope that had not died. The chief placed his hand on Jonah's shoulder and said, "You did well. You have the spirit of the river. You have the spirit of the dawn." Jonah looked at the chief and saw the lines on his face, the lines of many dawns, many nights, many battles. The chief smiled and said, "Now we begin again. Now we plant again. Now we live again. The dawn grew brighter, touching every face, touching every roof, touching every promise that had been kept. The day moved slow and soft across the village. The people worked with quiet hands and tired eyes. They carried water from the well to wash the ashes from the walls. They lifted the stones that had fallen. They cleared the burnt grass to prepare the soil for planting again. The children followed their mothers, holding small pots of water, helping with small hands, learning the way of healing the land. The goats moved between the huts, eating the dry leaves that had fallen during the fire there, bells making soft sounds like tiny prayers in the morning air. Jonah walked with the young men, checking the edges of the village, watching the hills for any sign of dust that would mean riders were coming back, watching the river as it moved calm and patient. The chief sat under the tree that had once held him captive, his eyes following the people as they worked, his face calm, but inside him there was a storm, a memory of ropes, a memory of fire, a memory of fear that he would never let return. Jonah stopped near the tree and looked at the chief, who looked back with eyes that were tired but bright. Jonah said, "They will come back." The chief nodded and said, "Yes, they will come back. They always come back, but we will be ready. We will not be afraid. We will not run." Jonah sat near the chief, the blackened stick beside him in the dirt. And they watched the people work. They watched the women singing softly to their children as they cleared the ashes. They watched the old men fixing the roof of the grain hut. They watched the young girls carrying baskets of seeds that had been saved from the fire. They watched the land begin to breathe again. The chief spoke, saying, "When they come back, they will come with more men. They will come with more fire. They will think we will kneel again, but we will not, because now they have seen who we are. Now they know that we will not let them take the spirit of this land." Jonah nodded and felt the river inside him calm and deep. He said, "We will be ready." The chief said, "You are ready already. You and the young ones, you carry the fire that cannot be taken. You carry the dawn that cannot be stolen." The day moved and the sun rose high. The people gathered near the well to share a meal of boiled roots and roasted goat. The children laughed and played near the water, their laughter like rain after a long dry season. The chief stood and spoke to the people, saying, "Today we begin again. Today we plant again. Today we remember that the land is ours, not because we say it, but because we care for it, because we bleed for it, because we rise for it." The people raised their hands in the air, their voices rising with the wind, their hearts beating like drums that would not stop. Jonah felt the promise in the ground, felt it in the dust, felt it in the laughter of the children, and in the quiet strength of the mothers. He felt it in the way the chief stood, like the tree that had once held him, like the mountain that watched them all, and he knew that when the riders returned, the village would not fall, the river would not stop, the dawn would not end. The morning the riders returned, the air was heavy with dust as they came over the hills, their faces hard and hungry, their eyes sharp with the promise of fear and the taste of power. The people of the village saw them coming, but no one ran, no one screamed, no one hid behind the broken walls. The chief stood in the center of the village with the dawn behind him and the river whispering softly in the distance. Jonah stood beside him, the blackened stick in his hand, like a promise, like a memory, like the fire that would not die. The riders came with their guns, with their knives, with their loud voices, shouting threats, shouting the promise of death and ashes, but the people did not move. The women stood with their children, their eyes clear and strong. The young men stood with their sticks, with their blades, with their hearts beating, steady like the drums that once called the rain. The chief raised his hand, and the village fell silent. The riders stopped near the well, near the tree that had once held the chief. They laughed and shouted, asking if the people were ready to kneel, if they were ready to give their daughters, if they were ready to give their land. The chief looked at them, his eyes calm like the deep river, and said, "We will not kneel. We will not give you our daughters. We will not give you our land." The riders laughed, and one of them moved forward, raising his gun, pointing it at the chief. But before the sound of the gun could break the morning, Jonah stepped forward with the blackened stick and struck the rider across the arm. The gun fell into the dust, and the rider screamed. The people moved like the river, like the storm, like the dawn that breaks the longest night. They moved with sticks, with stones, with blades, with the promise that they would not be broken. The riders tried to fight back, but their fear was louder than their guns. Their fear was deeper than their knives. The chief moved through them like the mountain that would not bow, his hands steady, his eyes clear. The people shouted as they took back their dawn, as they took back their river, as they took back their river, as they took back their spirit. The riders fell back. Some fled into the hills, their fear chasing them faster than the wind. The village stood together, the women holding their children, the young men holding their blades, the old ones holding the memory of the dawn. The chief turned to Jonah and placed his hand on his shoulder, saying, "Today You carried the fire today. You reminded them who we are today. You showed them that the spirit of the land cannot be taken. Jonah looked at the chief and saw the dawn reflected in his eyes. The river moving behind them, the people standing strong, the fear gone from their faces, and Jonah knew that the promise of the elders had been kept. The land was still theirs, the dawn was still theirs, the river was still theirs, and as the sun rose higher and the dust settled and the people began to sing, Jonah felt the promise move in his blood, like the river, like the dawn, like the fire that would never die.